highlight
AU-EU partnership. In November, leaders from both regions will meet in Luanda, Angola, for the 7th AU-AU summit, focusing on trade, on green and human development, and multilateral cooperation. The stakes are high. We have geopolitical rivalries, economic uncertainty, climate shocks, and a weakened multilateral system that undermines any collaboration on many different fronts. One issue that demands particular attention is debt sustainability. Sovereign debt has become a global and pressing concern. The African Union's first continental debt conference held this year produced the Lomé Declaration, calling for African-led solutions. Internationally, the Financing for Development Conference and South Africa's G20 Presidency have pushed for fairer debt systems. The African Leaders Debt Relief Initiative, founded by former heads of states of Africa, one of whom we are also hearing today, is another sign of growing momentum. These efforts highlight the need to unlock resources essential for inclusive and sustainable development. So today we want to discuss what role the African Union and the European Union can play in this context and how their partnership can deliver solutions. This event is made possible through a strong collaboration among some partners, which are Caritas Africa, Caritas Europe, the Debt Relief for a Green and Inclusive Recovery, DRGR project, Miserior, the European think tank group, EGTG, and the German Institute for Development and Sustainability, IDES. Our program will begin with 2 keynotes. We will hear from Nana Akufo-Addo, former president of Ghana and member of the African Leaders Debt Relief Initiative, ALDRI, and Ambassador Lavina Schram-Kesson, who is ambassador to the African Union and advisor to the African heads of states, the EU, and the UN. We will then, afterwards, hear some scene-setting remarks from Professor Ulrich Volz, who will provide us with some insights into the debt situation of the African continent, its links to climate and development, and the geopolitical implications. All these contributions will lead into a panel discussion that will be shared by San Bilal, Executive Director at ECTPM and board member of the ETTG. And afterwards, we'll open the floor for questions and comments. So you may already note some down while we go through the program. We'll be happy to receive questions online as well as here in the room. And so without further ado, I would like to pass the word on. We had originally planned that the president would start, but he's a little bit delayed. I think he's stuck in traffic. So my suggestion would be that we start instead with the ambassador, Ms. Ramkesan, who's joining us online. Good morning, Ambassador. Can you hear us?
Hi, good morning, everyone. I can hear you loud and clear.
1 second. We do not hear you yet. Start again.
We're saying good morning, everyone. Nice to be here.
Perfect. We can now hear you. The floor is yours.
Okay, amazing. Thank you very much. So, Excellencies, dear distinguished colleagues, partners, and friends, this morning, a very warm welcome from the African continent. My apologies for not being there in person. I have to say and admit that today is a great honor to be here and to join you in terms of having this very deep conversation and, really looking at tangible solutions and the path forward. So in terms of gratitude, it goes out to all the organizing partners for convening this very timely and critical dialogue. So if we had to deep dive, it is not only appreciation from an African Union perspective for the strategic dialogue, but also I think we find ourselves at a pivotal moment where we are defying a decade of technological economic movement for ourselves that has largely become very geopolitical. Africa's sovereign debt, as we all know, has reached very critical levels, 1.1 trillion in external obligations, and with about debt servicing consuming about 22% of the annual government returns. Some of this has been termed as a triple storm, being debt, climate vulnerability, and development constraints, all very deeply interlinked. The declaration that was recently signed says that Africa is no longer accepting debt that is one-sided contract, and therefore it must be a two-way value equation. By this default, debt is not just what we owe, it is also what we are owed. And this was highlighted as part of the Lomé Declaration. As we start from this new economic standpoint, we have a moment to emerge. And let us be clear that this future will not just be built with yesterday's tools, but with today and tomorrow in mind. I speak not only just as the representative of the African Union, but as part of a collective movement that is here to reshape how we understand this triple crisis and confronting our continent in all three ways. If we had to look at the declaration that was recently signed and how can Africa reclaim its agency, I think that there is a bold and a necessity in reaffirmation of the African agency. The Lomé Declaration was adopted by the leaders under the AU in 2024 with a bold recall to rethink debt, not just as a burden, but an opportunity to transform and to prioritize in three areas: debt justice as a foundation for the development of debt transparency, fair restructuring and enabling the need for a transparent, equitable debt restructuring mechanism, and a call for African ownership of economic governance that is accelerated by African-led solutions. This declaration, we can safely say, has moved from just being a policy document to becoming a moral compass for us. It has now, it allows us a position on sovereign debt, not merely as a financial issue, but one that becomes a developmental, economic, and a human rights issue. And it is guiding the work within the African Union in several ways. We're starting to think of things like smart climate debt frameworks. And through the African Debt Managers Network, we're enabling real-time data exchanges from end to end in our value chain system. What this means is that in real time, we could have a better understanding of what is actually happening on the continent. The establishment of early warning systems for sovereign risks are also being supported and being adopted by climate-resistant budget frameworks, combined with the investment optimization fund, example between the European Union and the African Union, and the advocacy for a unified African voice in larger international forums like the United Nations, G20, World Bank, IMF, and the rest. Africa keeps continuing to push for a permanent seat, both within the UN and other international forums. When we look at the AU-EU synergies, there's a lot to be discovered, from pledges into purposes. And what exactly are we looking at as our next narrative? The global gateway has become more than infrastructure. It has become a new partnership model, which we urge the EU to really work closely with the AU to align better. Co-design debt for climate data innovation swaps. What do we mean? Let us modernize traditional debt swaps by embedding digital, traceable community ownership that allows for debt swaps to happen in a fair, capitalized environment. Let us create an African EU technological transfer protocol, or even perhaps something like a joint sovereign rating observatory. Therefore, we can also look at alternative metrics, risk metrics that are not just only grounded in stereotypes, but one in sustainability. Innovation instruments also play a critical role when we talk about the Golden Gateway. Let us co-action hybrid financial tools. What do we mean? Launch a green talent mobility compact, perhaps, where we have Africa-skilled professionals as part of the global solution and not just part of the brain drain. How about even green equity tokens that could then open up the green finance corridors, robust taxonomy, or even sustainable financing, or even standardizing disclosures? This gateway is a promising start that can evolve into purpose, and one that can move from infrastructure into impact. Therefore, I propose that the EU-AU accelerates debt sustainability. A call for a shift of power, not just for policy. The time for incremental fixes are far beyond us, and we need to be rather revolutionary and transformational in terms of a global financial architect, and that begins with equal voice. We are projected to exceed 70 billion in 2025, funds that should perhaps be going to schools, hospitals, green infrastructure, and uplifting us to avoid the digital divide. Meanwhile, we face climate crises that are not created and barriers to financing that we do not design. Therefore, we need to move away from this to perhaps thinking of a joint call for an EU-AU task force to be defined that can specifically look at capitalizing a target of at least 1 trillion. Africa needs to move from cost of capital to cost of intelligence. This is something I've kind of spoken about a few times, where we are starting to find ourselves in a technological environment. What does this mean? This means that one has to move away from the traditional sense of cost of capital to a new base formula, a technological economy, which includes the cost of intelligence, cost of energy, and the cost of data. And with this new economic age, we can then define or redefine what the price value is, what interest rates are, and credit ratings could look like. Debt recalibration is another area that should be looped into this discussion. Multidimensional, trade-based contributions, technological skilled labors, or even climate contributions all become part of our value exchange. Africa's forests are capturing carbon for the world. Should it not count for our balance sheets? Our minerals are powering global technologies. Shouldn't that offset our debt burdens? Our people are solving for global challenges. Why are we not part of the equation? So in terms of our future and what this shape could look like, the tackling the triple crisis from debt, climate, and development requires more than financial engineering. It demands a fundamental shift in how we value people, how we value our planet, and how we value purpose. And as we move forward, we must remember that debt is not merely a fiscal obligation, but it is a reflection on who holds power in the global imagination. Climate resilience, too, cannot be threatened. And therefore, a nation's green capacity is as strategic as its GDP, only if one of them will matter in the next century. Progress is measured in GDP, but not in dignity, as is the debt we owe our future. The triple crisis cannot be solved in silos, and the climate does not stop at our borders. and neither should our solutions. Everyone here in the room today is required, from think tanks to governments to internationals to multinationals, multilaterals, and global citizens. We all are required to be part of the solution. Let me end by saying this. Africa does not, or rather, let me say it in this way. Africa seeks partnership, co-creation, and respect. We are designers, co-designers of solutions, contributors to the stability, innovators when it comes to climate, and the architects of tomorrow's economy. Let us move beyond this crisis by shaping a shared future together. Let us think out the box in terms of where and how we could then solve for this triple crisis. Let us move from diagnosis into action, from declarations into design, and from debt distress to dignified development. We are here designing a new global economy with climate creativity and community at its core. So let us all pledge here today to act swiftly and boldly and negotiate wisely and invest justly together. And thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ambassador, for these powerful words that will help us guide through the discussion this morning. I would now very much like to welcome Mr. Akufo-Addo, His Excellency, former President of Ghana, and the Ambassador of Ghana to the European Union, Mr. Machi. So with this said, Mr. President, may I ask you to come here to the lectern for your keynote address?
Gentlemen, let me apologize for being late. Traffic in Europe is a little bit more than it is in Accra. Ladies and gentlemen, as we gather on the eve of the AU-EU summit to mark 25 years of partnership, we're reminded that this milestone is not only a celebration of the past, but a gathering to decide what the next 25 years will mean for our people. For Africa, that future hangs in the balance. I've witnessed, as President of Ghana, the immense toll that unsustainable debt places on nations, stifling growth and dimming the hopes of our people. I witnessed the suffering, the suffocating grip of debt on our economy and on our citizens. This deeply troubled me and still does. Ghana's experience with debt restructuring under the G20 Common Framework offered some relief, but it also exposed the deep structural weaknesses of the global financial system. The sobering truth is that the global financial system is not built to free us, rather to bind us. And so today, I do not speak for Ghana alone. I speak for Africa, for millions whose futures depend on our courage in this moment. We must call with one united voice for a bold and comprehensive global debt relief initiative, an initiative that moves beyond temporary fixes, an initiative that delivers true economic liberation and lasting development for our continent. Let me begin by painting a picture of the reality we face. Africa's debt burden has ballooned to staggering levels. As of 2025, the continent's external debt exceeds $1 trillion United States dollars, more than double what it was just 5 years ago. According to the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, in 2023, developing countries together, which Africa has a major component, paid nearly $487 billion in servicing external public debt. That number is staggering. $487 billion. For half of these nations, it means sacrificing at least 6.5% of all their export earnings just to stay current on debt. And in Africa, the reality is even starker. Research from Boston University and Christian Aid tells us that more than 30 African countries are now spending more on interest payments, loan, than on public health. Not on total debt service, only on interest. Money that does not build schools, money that does not train nurses, money that does not save a single life. This is simply not an economic statistic. It is a moral indictment, because every dollar diverted to creditors is a dollar taken from a hospital, from a child's vaccination, from a community's future. The choice before us is thus clear. Will we allow nations to keep choosing between paying their creditors and protecting their citizens? Or will we summon the courage to reform a system that forces such a choice? The answer to that question will define not just our economies, but even more significantly, our humanity. Ladies and gentlemen, today, 21 African countries stand either at high risk of debt distress or already trapped within it. And the trap is cruel, a vicious cycle where climate vulnerability feeds debt, and debt deepens climate vulnerability. Our economies are amongst the most exposed to climate shocks anywhere in the world, yet we're also among the least equipped fiscally to respond. The evidence is clear. The more climate vulnerable a nation, the higher the cost of borrowing it must endure. This climate risk premium inflates the price of capital for African governments, eroding fiscal space and crowding out priority social and infrastructure spending. The inevitable result is underinvestment. That underinvestment then heightens exposure to the next climate shock, and so the cycle spins, tightening its grip. Ladies and gentlemen, this crisis is not of Africa's making alone. Global shocks, the COVID-19 pandemic, the war in Ukraine and in the Middle East, and the mounting tone of climate disasters have deepened vulnerabilities rooted in an international order that is profoundly unjust. African nations, rich in resources and potential, are forced to export raw materials at depressed prices while importing finished goods at a premium. Our debt to GDP ratios, averaging around 60 to 70%, may seem modest compared to the G7's over 111%, but the terms are punitive. Interest rates for African borrowers are often double or triple those faced by wealthier nations, turning loans into shackles rather than lifelines. This is not economics, it is inequity. Reflecting on Ghana's journey, when my administration turned to the G20 Common Framework in 2023, the path was anything but straightforward. We faced delays, complex negotiations, and uneven burden sharing. But persistence paid off. In 2024, we restructured about $13 billion of euro bonds and secured commitments that will deliver roughly $10.5 billion in external debt service relief through 2026. As a result of these efforts, our debt ratio, which had climbed to the mid-50s as a share of GDP, declined to about 70.5% in 2024. This progress underpinned our IMF program and restored investor confidence. And with stability came momentum. Ghana's economy grew by 5.57% last year, one of the strongest performances in Africa. But we should be clear, the process was sequential, not simultaneous. It prolonged uncertainty. It eroded investor confidence, and it inflicted a heavy cost at home that was a dark cloud moment for me as president. Domestic bondholders, pensioners, youth, ordinary Ghanaians bore losses that shattered livelihoods. Even now, as Ghana begins to re-emerge, the relief feels less like a solution and more like a pause before the next storm. The framework we signed up to under the program, while a step forward, is fundamentally flawed. It lacks binding rules to hold all creditors, public and private, to fair burden sharing. It fails to address the structural roots of debt accumulation. In short, it offers reprieve, not resolution. That is why Africa needs something bigger, something bolder, a new global debt relief initiative, ambitious, equitable, and tailored to our realities. I've long called for the cancellation of Africa's debts, as I did in 2021 on international platforms, urging debt forgiveness to unlock resources for development. I'm renewing that call today. Let us reflect for one moment on a program of debt relief for green investment and resilience, linking debt cancellation directly to investments in climate adaptation and sustainable growth. Africa contributes less than 4% of global emissions, and yet we suffer the brunt of climate change. Droughts that ravage crops, floods that displace entire communities. It is time the world recognized this injustice and acted with the urgency it demands. Let me remind this gathering of a landmark truth. In an advisory opinion of the International Court of Justice, affirmed the duty to make reparation for climate damages. That duty can take the form of restitution, compensation, satisfaction, or a combination of all three. And even the most conservative estimates, the scale of such reparations runs into the trillions. Seen in that light, debt relief for Africa is not an act of generosity. It is an act of justice. For much of the debt we carry was incurred in responding to climate shocks, not of our making. But justice delayed is justice denied. That is why, as a pragmatic step, we must reform the G20 Common Framework to make it faster and fairer. As the African Union's Debt Conference in Lomé emphasized earlier this year, all creditors, public, private, and multilateral, must be compelled to participate in ensuring comparability of treatment. The IMF and World Bank's 2025 restructuring playbook is a beginning, but it must evolve into a binding global compact. Comprehensive proposals already exist. The Debt Relief for Green and Inclusive Recovery Project has laid out solutions including targeted relief, lower interest rates, and longer maturities. Taken together, these could release billions for achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. Yet debt relief by itself is not enough. It must be matched by Africa's own reforms. I've long argued that our continent must move beyond aid by embracing efficiency, transparency, and domestic resource mobilization. In Ghana, we have digitized our tax system, strengthening the fight against corruption, and invested in education and agriculture and infrastructure. Across Africa, we must build stronger institutions, diversify our economies, and expand trade through the African Continental Free Trade Area. But let us be clear, without global support, even the most courageous reforms will be undermined. Undermined by predatory lending, by punitive terms of trade, by a financial system that too often works against us rather than with us. Ladies and gentlemen, earlier this year, I joined 7 fellow African leaders, former presidents, prime ministers, and vice presidents, in launching the African Leaders Debt Relief Initiative in Cape Town. We chose to act because we can express what sitting ministers and heads of governments often cannot. Too often, silence prevails as leaders seek to endure pressures or remain absorbed by domestic challenge that debt relief, ironically, could help ease. Indeed, African nations are being asked to endure the unbearable. Must commend President Cyril Ramaphosa, the President of South Africa, who hosted us for an extensive dialogue and gave us full support to our advocacy. He did not stop there. The very next day, addressing the G20 meeting of finance ministers, he publicly endorsed our initiative. His leadership matters, and so does the timing. In just over 2 months, the G20 will meet in Johannesburg, the first such gathering ever held on African soil, just ahead of the AU-EU summit in Luanda. Progress on debt is still possible, and we know it is a priority for President Ramaphosa. As a former president and advocate for debt relief for Africa, my time and experiences are at the disposal of any initiative that addresses the huge burden of debt carried on by African countries. To our European partners, I say this: you hold significant influence within the G20. Germany, France, Italy, United Kingdom, and the European Union. You command 5 seats at that table. Africa, home to more than 1.5 billion people, has only 2, South Africa and the African Union. So I entreat you, hear the voice of your neighboring continent. Stand with the AU and with the South African G20 presidency to advance ambitious reform of the Common Framework and to establish a truly comprehensive global debt relief initiative in this Jubilee year of 2025. Implement the solutions already on the table. I'm talking about immediate debt service suspension, comprehensive restructuring, and new concessional financing. By doing so, you do not invest in charity. You invest in partnership. You invest in a prosperous Africa that contributes to global stability and shared growth. The benefits of debt relief for Africa and for the world are enormous and life-changing. It strengthens economic stability. Today, too many African nations spend more on debt than on healthcare or education. By easing this burden, governments can invest in essential services and unlock new opportunities for trade and investment, creating gains that ripple across the global economy. It also delivers profound humanitarian dividends. Free resources can reduce poverty, expand education, and build resilient health systems. That does not only help Africa, it protects the world from future pandemics and humanitarian crises. Debt relief enhances peace and security as well. Crushing debt often fuels unrest and instability. Lifting that weight to support stability and reduce risks that affect us all, from migration pressures to global security threats. Debt relief also strengthens the fight against climate change. Tools such as debt for climate swaps enable African nations to invest in renewable energy, conservation, and adaptation, protecting a continent rich in resources yet deeply vulnerable to climate shocks. And above all, debt relief is a matter of moral leadership. By pursuing it, the international community acknowledges historic inequalities and inequities, builds trust, and renews global cooperation. In short, relieving Africa's debt is not just good for Africa, it is good for the world. What helps Africa helps us all. We stand at a crossroads. We can allow debt to weigh down nations, stifle opportunity, and fuel instability. Or we can choose a different path, one of partnership, growth, and shared responsibility. Debt relief is not an act of generosity. It is a strategic choice for a safer, healthier, and more sustainable world. So let us act, not tomorrow, not in the distant future, but now. Let us match words with courage and commitments with action. The sacrifices we make today, the compromises, the collaborations we engage in today can only inure to the benefit of our world. Let us take a cue from the impacts of global warming. If it has taught us anything, it has taught us one thing. We are all impacted, no matter who is doing what, when, why, how, and where. In the same vein, when Africa rises from the weight of debt, the whole world rises with it. In closing, let us envision an Africa unbound, a continent where debt no longer dictates destiny, where our youth innovate freely and our resources fuel shared responsibility and prosperity. As I said in my addresses before, Africa is eager, Africa is willing. With a global debt relief initiative, we can transform crisis into opportunity. Together, let us forge this path. Thank you, and may God bless Africa.
Excellency, Your Excellency, thank you very much for your not only very inspiring words, but also dedicated action and concrete proposals on the way forward. My name is San Bilal. I'm board member of the ETTG, European Think Tank Group, and the Executive Director of ECDPM. I know that Marit Maj has to go. She's a member of the European Parliament. She has a meeting starting in a few minutes. So she was meant to participate to our panel, but I think just if you allow me, Professor, just if you could, Madam, tell us a few words. You're a member of the European Parliament. You have been also a member of the delegation of the Africa EU Parliamentary Assembly, and you have been also a shadow rapporteur on the European Parliament reports on the financing for development. So if you could just tell us what can Europe do to help address some of the challenges that the President Akufo-Addo so nicely outlined.
Thank you very much, and thank you for this opportunity to be here and to talk to you. And thank you very much, Your Excellency, for your speech. Also, the ambassador. I think what you both said that resonates is, I think you said, Your Excellency, that the debt is not built to free us, but it's built to bind us. And in sort of the same words, the ambassador, she said, the debt does not reflect a fiscal structure, it reflects a power balance. And I think these are very true words. It also reminds me on, well, your question was, what can Europe do and what can the European Union do? Unfortunately, I think we have to rephrase that question, and we have to rephrase it in what does the European Union want to do? What do we really want in political terms right now to do to act on that triple crisis that we are discussing here today, which is the crisis of debt, the crisis of climate change, and also the crisis of human development in the continent of Africa. And I must say that, unfortunately, I see that the European member states, but also the European Parliament, is looking inward more and more, is looking more and more towards what we apparently feel as the main issues that are issues internally within our own member states and internally within the European Union, issues of security, and much less those issues of our relationship with the sister continent in the south, as was mentioned by you, Your Excellency. And I think it's it's so important that we do not forget that we have this relationship, that we have the continent that, next to us, with a lot of bilateral relationships in economic and political, in all kinds of other terms, and that we make sure that we develop this relationship in a mutually beneficial way. Now, you asked me, Bilal, about our financing for development program that we financing for development report that we made in within the European Parliament, starting in the run-up to the Financing for Development Summit in Seville. We had, I think, a very good report. It was a report that talked about equitable, sustainable development. It was a report that talked about increased efforts on gender equality. It was a report that talked about debt relief in several ways, but it also talked about changing the structures of development banks, making sure that countries in the global south in general, but specifically also from the African continent, have a bigger say in the structures of these banks. Unfortunately, this report from the European Parliament was voted down. There was not a majority in the European Parliament for this report, mainly also because of these issues that I mentioned. So I think we have a big challenge and we have a big job to do. We have a big challenge, which is, of course, the challenge in the African continent itself, but we have a big job to do within the European Union to make sure that we understand that there is a mutual interest on both sides, that we have all these relations, that we have to move forward, and that we really have to look at debt, because we were joking before this. I think we are sort of the same age, Bilal, and we were joking before this meeting that when we were in university, debt relief was already an issue, and was already an issue that was discussed also globally, because there was already a lot of pressure on a number of countries in the global south, and it has only increased, as you rightfully said, Your Excellency, that the debt on the African continent has doubled in the last 5 years, and it was already a problem years ago. So I think it's really a challenge for us right now, and I hope that we can do this together to make sure that European leaders, the European Parliament, European politicians are aware of the fact that this is also something that we should put on our agenda, not on number 5 or number 10 of the priorities, but much higher on the priorities, because I think your final words were well, probably the words that we need to share, all of us, that if your neighbor is doing well, you are doing well. And this is, I think, the real challenge that we have within the European Union, to make sure that we not only look at ourselves, but we also look at our neighbors and make sure that we develop together. Thank you very much.
Right. I cannot let you go without just asking a question. You started your speech by saying that Europe is increasingly inward looking. Then you say we should reach out to Africa. But how do you convince, your colleagues that are on different spectrum of the political agenda at the European Parliament? How do you convince the European member states that the issue of debt is important? Are we not just preaching among ourselves that, yes, we should do it, but in reality, nothing will change? How can you convince them beside the fact that, we should simply care about Africa on the moral grounds?
Maybe I think probably the issue that we see most is the fact that we have economic relationships, growing economic relationships. We have an interest in Europe in a digital transition, in the electricity transition, and all the nice, I think, raw materials, critical raw materials that we need for those transitions are to be found in our neighboring continent. And we want this relationship with our neighboring continent on these critical raw materials. So I think there really is a good step for mutual interest, because there's mutual interest on several issues. There's mutual interest in the economic relationship. And of course, on the right, there's always the discussion about migration. There's mutual interest on trying to make sure that we have a good migration relationship. So if we underline more the elements that we have in common, that are also positive elements and that can develop ourselves, but also the countries in the global south. If we work on, I don't know, on mining, for example, if we work on those critical raw materials, it's important to make sure that it's helpful for those that are in the end using it, but it's also helpful for those that are living around and working in these areas. So I think there's a lot of common interest. We have to make sure that more people are aware of it, and it will be higher on the agenda than only, because when we talk about the African continent, people often talk about problems, where there's much more than problems. There's also solutions. There's beauty. There is possibilities of common issues to develop. So I think we have to look at that side as well. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for sharing some of your words, and apologies to your colleagues for you coming late. But thank you very much for staying there.
Leaving now. I'm sorry. Not out of disinterest, but there's another issue that I have to attend to. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Let me turn to Professor Heinrich-Böll. You have a very long title, Professor of Economics, Director of the Center for Sustainable Finance at SOAS, University of London, and Senior Research Fellow at the German Institute of Development Sustainability, and co-chair of Debt Relief for Green and Inclusive Recovery. Could you give us perhaps briefly some kind of overview of the situations where we are, and perhaps some guiding directions for the way forward?
Yeah, thank you, and good morning. That's well. I actually did prepare a presentation, but I'm not going to deliver it now because we've already had a wonderful scene setting both by the ambassador and also the president, so I couldn't do any better anyway. But of course, we're also a bit behind time. So, but I'd just like to, and then I mean, if there's interest, we can share the presentation. We've also have a report. Or actually, could you maybe put up the slides and just go to the very last one, the very last slide, because there's a QR code with our report on this very topic from the Debt Relief for Green Inclusive Recovery project. So all the kind of graphs I was going to show are in there anyway. But I just wanted to make a few points. So the first one is, the way debt sustainability is being analyzed. And that's where, I mean, it's kind of very technical issue in a way, but it's really fundamental on how this whole discussion is progressing. And So both the ambassador and the president have made very clear there is a debt crisis facing many African countries. Of course, not all, but there are really a significant number of countries that will need some kind of debt relief, debt restructuring. But if we look at the analysis of the International Monetary Fund, which is kind of the prime institution in this space, the debt sustainability analysis for low-income countries identifies 7 countries that are in debt distress in Africa and 14 that are deemed to have a high risk of external debt distress. So that's 24 countries. But only 4 of them, the debt sustainability assessment actually says the debt is unsustainable. So even countries that are in debt distress, for example, Ghana, the IMF says the debt is sustainable now after the restructuring. And so the problem fundamentally is that a lot of the projections are far too optimistic, and there's been a lot of study on that. So if you assume high growth rates and so on, then of course it can grow out of debt. But the assumptions often are not realistic at all. And second, debt sustainability analysis really do not sufficiently account for major climate risk. They don't account for critical investment needs in climate resilience, in sustainable development. And these are investments that are really not kind of optional or should not be optional. Yeah? So the president has referred to the vicious cycle of debt, climate, and underdevelopment. That's kind of a framework that we've put forward almost a decade ago when we looked at the nexus between climate vulnerability and the cost of debt, where we were able to show climate vulnerability is driving up the cost of capital. So climate vulnerable countries, which tend to have to pay higher debt anyway, even have to pay now a climate risk premium. And so this is really constraining fiscal space. Countries can't invest in resilience and development. And this is a problem. And so the current global debt governance structure with a common framework that the president has referred to is basically setting an incentive for governments that are facing debt problems to try everything they can to repay the debt. Because, and if I may say, I think Ghana is an example. Ghana should have had a debt restructuring way before, but countries know that going to the IMF, going to the common framework is not going to be a very nice process. And unfortunately also kind of a very drawn out process. And at the end of it, most countries will not get really sufficiently high debt relief. So the incentive for over-indebted countries is basically try everything you can to repay your debt, to not default on your debt. But the implication is that we have a lot of countries that are defaulting on their development, that are defaulting also on their climate goals. And this is going to make things much, much worse in the longer run. And so we need to really reform debt sustainability analysis. I mean, this topic has become a big one. The IMF is working on it, but we need to put a lot of pressure on making sure that these reforms are really meaningful. And then I want to quickly say something about the geoeconomic, geopolitical implications. I think we've already seen a massive erosion of trust of African nations vis-a-vis kind of the Western countries, including, of course, European Union countries. And this has many dimensions. I mean, we've seen kind of this vaccine apartheid, but there's been certainly a perception of double standards, you know, kind of when there is a major Swiss bank failing, we can very quickly mobilize resources. But when we see a large number of African countries struggling. You know, it's their problem. It's not our problem, apparently. But of course, it is our problem. And also, when we look at climate finance, you know, we have a lot of kind of unmet promises. ODA is now being cut, and so the message that comes out from Europe and the MEP has highlighted that is not really one of you know, building a stronger partnership. And what we are seeing, or what we've seen over the last couple of years, is other major powers, including China, of course, but also Russia, Turkey, Arab states, being much more engaged in across the African continent, and well, you know, we as Europeans are really losing influence, where kind of our standing is in decline, and that should not or that should bother us. And the problem is that, of course, the debt crisis that we are seeing now in many countries are worsening economic prospects going forward. This can also, and in some cases has already, led to increased political instability, which in turn is not going to help future development. And so this is going to create all kinds of new problems. And I think it was important to highlight the opportunities that are out there. And for Europe, I would very strongly maintain that in the current geopolitical environment, we really must do everything to build strong partnerships, nurture our relationship with African countries, and create kind of prosperity that will benefit both sides. And so I think there are a lot of upsides, and there is a lot of power that Europe still has for the time being in global fora. You highlighted, Your Excellency, the role in the G20. We are major shareholders of the Bretton Woods institutions, so we can, for the time being, still use our global power. And the cost of debt relief, by the way, would actually not be that great for public balance sheets, because a lot of the debt is actually private. I'll leave it here, but just want to highlight, I think there is a very strong rationale for the EU to really push this agenda, to support strong recoveries, strong partnerships with African countries. Thank you.
If you allow me, just I want to pick up on your last comment, which is in a sense perhaps a bit troubling, because you say that the cost of the restructuring the debts would not be so big for the public sector because it's mainly private. But isn't it the fact that it is mainly private debts that makes it more complex, and also that the range of public debts are broader? That you mentioned China, Russia, Turkey, and so isn't that increasing the complexity even for Europeans to think about a debt restructuring? And I think I hear some comments in Europe to say, well, why should we pay for the cost of debt restructuring with public savings, and when we have fiscal constraints where some other emerging economies will not pay for it, and where the private sector will not contribute either? And then when we try to have this all together, then nobody's moving, and it seems that this might be one of the reasons of the lack of action also on the debt. Well, but you seem to say it should not be that a problem. Can you perhaps explain?
Well, I'm not saying it's not a problem, but I mean, we've done all the calculations, and I'm happy to. So they're on the Debt Relief for Green Inclusive Recovery project website. So first of all, you're very right. I mean, right now, nothing is really moving. We have this situation where basically, over-indebted governments are effectively forced to stay quiet and kind of not raise the issue, which is also why it's so important to have leaders who can freely speak and do raise their voice, just that, like the president is doing. The problem starts with the denial. So for the time being, kind of, if you listen to the IMF, mostly also World Bank, even though the World Bank chief economist has been very vocal that there is a debt crisis, and he has openly called for kind of a debt relief initiative, but he's being told to stay quiet on this. So all the major powers, so US, China, Europe, basically have no interest in having a discussion about a debt relief, because they think, oh, kind of it's going to be costly for us, so just looking at from a EU perspective, looking at the EU situation, the bilateral debt of EU country, kind of the bilateral debt that African countries or low-income countries more generally owe to the EU bilaterally is very small. That's not really going to be so it's not really make a big difference. But the key point is to really have a meaningful debt relief initiative. We would need to involve multilateral institutions. That's where it's getting really tricky. And so the EU and the US have been saying all along, no. Multilateral institutions, they have preferred creditor status. They will not participate in debt relief. In the past, with HIPC, they did participate. But back then, the situation was also less complex, because we basically it was mostly official debt. Now, private debt is a much greater share, which is in a certain way complicating this thing. But the key problem is we lack the will to push it forward. So, for example, we had extensive exchange with the Biden administration. They actually shared our assessment of a substantial debt crisis. And they said, yes, there should be some kind of debt relief, but in an election year, they were not going to push forward and anger Wall Street, because that was just politically not a good move. I mean, they lost anyway, but and I mean, the new US administration is also not really gonna push for private finance involvement. But for example, in London, that's a place where much of the Eurobonds have been issued. We've been having discussion about new legislation that would facilitate debt restructuring. The UK government also still is very hesitant on that. But at the end of the day, I would say it really is an issue of political will. And we've seen that before in previous debt restructurings. So if the major powers really do agree to move forward with that, there are definitely ways of involving private creditors. Just one point. So China has actually been the country that has been most involved in debt restructurings in Africa and elsewhere, but rather more quietly. And they have been not keen on any kind of multilateral initiative. So they want to deal with these things bilaterally. And of course, we've seen a lot of blame on China from the US, from Europe, but that's been not particularly helpful, and if anything, has rather diminished the chance of China doing this, because China's not going to give in to these pressures. But very importantly, by refusing the involvement of multilateral institutions in debt relief, by not really trying to push the private creditors to participate in debt relief, kind of Western powers have given China a good reason to say, well, kind of, if you're not going to do that, why are you looking at us to provide debt relief? So my hypothesis is, if we were to put forward an ambitious debt relief initiative involving China, it would be and involving multilateral institutions, it would be very difficult for China to kind of refuse that. Because that would really harm China's standing with developing countries. But for now, since Europe is not doing anything, and kind of why should China move more than us? I mean, we're doing more than us anyway.
Yeah, thank you very much for this clarification and helping us understanding this very complex arena. Let me turn to Mr. Magnus Gilbert. You're Secretary of Embassy in charge of Africa relations, and you're also responsible of the Africa Working Party at the Council, the COAF, and you're also dealing with the Global Gateway working at the permanent representation of Denmark, the EU. And knowing that Denmark has now the presidency of the council, so you're quite a busy person involved in these issues on Africa-Europe relations. A week away from the Global Gateway Forum that will take place from 9th and 10th of October. How do you see the opportunities for Europe engaging better and perhaps in a different manner with Africa?
So thank you very much, San. Thank you, Your Excellency, Mr. President, for your comprehensive and charismatic presentation of this these challenges that we're facing together. And thank you, Professor Foltz, for your detailed explanations as well. I think the subheading of this event is exactly the EU-AU summit, and I think that will be a key moment for strengthening the EU-African relations. And I think turning to the topic of today's discussions on debt, climate, and development, I think an important precondition for finding the common answers to this will be a strengthened political partnership among the continents. I think Professor Foltz talked about this erosion of trust and this need for a strengthened partnership among our two continents. And that is exactly what the EU-AU summit should bring. When I've been in meetings at the political level with African countries, and I've had the chance to hear about their expectations for the summit, it's been a recurring theme from the African side to talk about debt and to talk about the need for investments. So I think those are definitely among their key concerns, and then Europe needs to show that we listen attentively and engage constructively on finding solutions on that. But in such a political partnership, there is a need for a strengthened and more frequent dialogue. And if the ambassador talked about, the need for maybe a task force of some kind. I'm approaching this from a government policy practitioner's point of view, a bit from the corridors of the buildings over there. And that's a track that we are working on in the ministerial declaration. You'll see that we agreed to strengthen the follow-up mechanism. And that may sound a bit like a bureaucratic exercise, but I think this need for more structured, recurrent dialogue at more levels, not just at high-level events, but also between them, will be key. Also to align expectations, because if I may share an anecdote, I was in a meeting with a high-ranking minister of an African country some time ago, me and my colleagues, and he told us quite a few times how he would very much like us to lower interest rates for the reasons that have been outlined today, because he also shared with us these challenges they're facing in paying off debts. Now, of course, almost thankfully, I would say, me and my colleagues in government do not have the power to set interest rates. I think that's probably a good thing. But I think that speaks to a lesson to align expectations in our dialogue with the African partners on what is possible and what is not possible, and what we can and can't do, and what we are willing to do. Summits like these will serve as a good event for that. You mentioned the Global Gateway, where I'm chairing the negotiations among the member states during the Danish presidency of the Council of the European Union. I think that is really one of the key European offers that we have to help these countries make progress on their development trajectories by mobilizing investments, by leveraging private sector investments in these countries. And I very much hope, and we aim, that we will show the strong results that this has delivered at the summit, and that we will also show some solid deliverables going ahead.
Thank you very much, Magnus. Of course, from the political level, you don't have the capacity yet. I mean, we know that providing concessional finance and more concessional finance, the EIB is able to raise funding at the international markets to much lower rates. There are discussions of for the Commission to support much more local currency lending, and so there are many. I'm sorry, that's the financier in me that is speaking, but there are many ways that in which providing some financial instruments, and I'm sure Professor you would agree to try to lower the interest rates. That's that the Africans are participating to. Of course, you cannot lower the market ones, but you can leverage the capacity of the EU to provide both guarantees and leverage interest rate. I don't know if you want to reply briefly on that. And in fact, if we want to go from the scaling up the global gateway, increasing the investment in Africa, knowing the debt burden, there will be needs, as you were mentioning, to connect investments and debt questions, no?
Yeah, I think if there's one thing that the dear audience should remember my intervention for, it's maybe to look at the broad EU policy toolbox in this context. I'd very much dive into the global gateway, but since we have the pleasure and honor of the former president of Ghana here, I'd maybe like to just mention an example of how the broad policy toolbox can be brought to use to address these concerns, because my government has one challenge for African governments, African countries' development is this high risk perception, right? Which leads to a higher cost of capital. And there are many reasons for that. I think it's well known that some African actors consider it unfair. On that, I won't pass judgment, but I think we need to take that seriously, and we need to engage constructively to find solutions. And I think just one example from my country, I mean, some are arguing that one reason for high risk perception is poor data quality in African markets. And Denmark has a government-to-government cooperation in Ghana and soon in other African countries, where we help national statistics agencies improve quality and granularity of data, for example, on metrics like trade and inflation. And while it's not maybe the main goal, it's something that can help these countries perhaps access better conditions for financing down the line. It can also help strengthen policymaking in these countries. So just an example of how bringing the broad policy toolbox into the dialogue also can show some different avenues for addressing these concerns with the African countries.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much for this nice example. Let me turn to our last speaker, who is online. I think it's Wesley Shibamba, who is Regional Policy and Advocacy Officer at Keynotes Africa. And I wanted perhaps to ask you, Mr. Shibamba, is he online? Can you hear us? Yes? Perfect. I just wanted to ask you, what is then your perspective from, you have been also leading on the Jubilee debt campaign for Africa. What is your perspective on what you have heard so far in the discussion and possibilities on the way forward to address the debt problems in Africa? And thank you for joining us online.
Thank you so much, Bilal. I'm honored and excited to be here with you today. Indeed, very powerful speeches, of remarks from the excellencies and from the member of parliament, as well as from the learned colleagues, Professor Volds and Magnus. Really, what that tells you from what everybody has said is the gravity and urgency of the problem. Africa stands at an intersection of three systemic crises right now that we're discussing: debt distress, climate vulnerability, and development stagnation. So I will make reference to some of the declarations and reports that have been made. Really, we have the Jubilee debt report that was done by the commission headed by Professor Stiglitz. we've got the Compromiso de Sevilla, we've got the Cape Town Declaration, of which His Excellency was part, and then we've got the Lomé Declaration. So you find that all of these documents speak to the same thing, and an equivocal call for systemic reforms. Basically, all talking about reforms to the global financial architecture. And I see 5 convergence pillars across all of these documents. I'm deliberately bringing all of these because each of the previous speakers spoke to them. The first thing is around reforming the global financial architecture. A common example that all of them refer to is the fact that the G20 Common Framework has failed to address the problem. The problem is urgent. It needs immediate responses. The G20 Common Framework is slow, it's creditor-driven, and frankly, it's no longer fit for purpose. And when you look at all of these declarations and reports, they would tell you that. And that's why you find that some of us who are champions
We're losing the sound here. Can you just, you said,
debt campaign.
can you hear me? We
Yes, I
lost the
can.
sound on what you were saying. You were talking
My
about the
apologies. Maybe
G20 Common Framework that was slow, and then we didn't hear you.
Great, thank you. So I'll start from there. All of these reports and declarations talk about systemic reforms, and the common thing that you find in all of these is the fact that the G20 Common Framework is not working in terms of debt relief. And therefore, in the Jubilee Debt campaign, we are proposing that a new framework be set up. With all due respect to the efforts that have gone already into the G20 framework, we are proposing that a new framework be set up under the UN that would take care of all these problems that have already been referred to by His Excellency under the G20 framework. So basically, there is that unequivocal call for reforms to these systemic structures that are governing the finance sector. But more importantly, when you look at the Lomé Declaration as well as the Cape Town Declaration, you find that there are very bold calls for debt cancellation. Might not be a very popular topic, but that is something that we are also advocating for, the cancellation of unjust and unsustainable debt. Some sort of reset, if you like, some sort of HIPIC 2.0, for lack of a better term. Because even if we suspend debt repayments for these countries, which are already under debt distress, we're merely postponing the problem. So cancellation seems to be a way forward for us to free them in terms of fiscal space to invest in health, to invest in education, and for them to take climate action. At the moment, development has stagnated because they lack fiscal space to invest in all of these important social sectors as well as climate action. But then there are other bolder steps and calls that are being made. You need to look at, for example, if you look at climate finance and justice as a pillar of convergence against all these reports and declarations I've told you about, everyone is talking about scaling up climate finance. It should be accessible, it should be equitable. But more than that, in the Cape Town Declaration, you find that it is being referred to as a moral obligation on part of the global north, because they are responsible for over 96% of global pollution. So there are those bold calls that are being made in all of these, But then we need to see how we can make all of these workable. In the Lomé Declaration, they are calling it climate risk integration, if you like, in terms of data assessment. So we can use all of these things, but really, the point is we need to make reforms to the global financial architecture as it exists now. It is unjust, it is dysfunctional, and it doesn't serve the people. So we need to move away from these econocentric models that are looking only at economic development through the lens of GDP as a model for development, to models that put human beings and the planet at the center, to models that put human development at the center. And in terms of responses to the problems that Africa is going through right now, including economic stagnation and all of that, you find that debt relief is one of those primary solutions, be it in terms of climate finance, be it in terms of investments in other sectors. Once countries have had that fiscal space unlocked from paying debt service and interest payments, then you find that they will have that kind of leverage and relief to invest in other relevant sectors. And then, of course, we talk about issues of South to South cooperation. This shouldn't be seen as a replacement of the North to South cooperation. I think it should be seen as complementary, because it's still relevant that that North to South cooperation takes the lead in terms of development financing. So I'll leave it there for now. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let me just turn to you, because I think we all agree, probably in this room, on the moral imperative and the necessity to do reforms. At the same time, I mean, we're in Brussels here, which is normally when I travel, as people ask me what's the atmosphere in Brussels, I say it's all gloom and doom. People are very pessimistic. We've heard Member of Parliament, Maj, saying, we are very inward looking. So if I look at the UN, when you say we should discuss the debt issue at the UN, I mean, on the global stage, it seems that the UN becomes increasingly irrelevant, and there's a need to reform the UN itself, and that power politics seems to be dominant. So while we understand what should be the end game, but what would be, in your view, the way to try to address these concerns that many Europeans would say, well, we have our own fiscal constraints, and if we do it in the UN, it's not going to lead anywhere, because the UN is malfunctioning, and we have these fragmented worlds where power politics and tensions between the members of the G20, and so how can we try to build a consensus now and not wait for? I mean, there will be a brighter future, I'm sure, but if we want in this very fragmented and tense global order, what could be the first steps that we could be taking to address the immediate debt crisis that is and distress that is happening in Africa? What's your perspective? What would be your arguments to some of our Europeans partners here?
Yeah, so I think we need to look at the intention behind the calling for a UN-backed debt framework. It stems from the fact that the G20 framework, the common framework, has failed. But we need to look at what people really want out of that. It may not necessarily be a UN-backed debt framework, but it could be something else, as long as the points are taken into account. For example, right now, what is lacking is inclusivity, predictability, fairness, timeliness in these negotiations. A lot of previous speakers have spoken to, the private sector taking.
I don't know if something
hello?
changed. It's an issue of the connection.
Hello, are you able to hear me now?
Sorry. So, well, perhaps
hello?
let me just open Yes. Mr. President, you want to say something? No. So perhaps we can open now the floor for a few questions to be addressed. Who wants to come in? Or Wesley, you're back?
Are you able to
No,
hear
we
me?
still have a sound problem.
Okay.
I'm really sorry. We'll try to fix that out, and in the meantime, we can take perhaps some other questions. But you have to leave. Well, thank you very much, Your Excellency, for your participation. This was really an honor for us to have you with us. Thank you very much. No, thank you.
Yes. Maybe while people think about their questions, just wanted to go back to the costs of debt relief. So we did well, 1.5 years ago, we did some calculations looking at the outstanding debt, which countries would probably need some kind of debt relief, and then how much would it cost? And if we were, for example, to take 41 IDA countries, so countries that are eligible for concessional finance from the World Bank, and have a substantial haircut on outstanding debt, that would provide $90 billion in debt relief. 29 billion out of that would be from the Paris Club, so that's kind of mostly the rich countries, although Brazil, for example, is in there as well, and MDBs. And so if, for example, a country like Germany, that would amount with bilateral debt and kind of covering for multilateral debt relief, that would cost only $1 billion, which in the larger scheme of things is not very much. And this would not be just in 1 year, that would be over longer time periods. So the cost, especially if we talk about low-income countries, of course, if we look at kind of large middle-income countries like Pakistan or something, that would be a different scale, but I don't think this would be realistic. And one thing that we should also bear in mind is that what we're currently seeing is basically a massive bailout of private creditors. So we have, basically private capital has largely retreated from much of the developing world, including from Africa. So a lot of the finance that comes in from MDBs, from the International Monetary Fund, is actually used to repay private creditors and China. So if we talk about protecting public funds, we should be also looking at this.
Thank you very much, Sarah.
Yes. Okay. I have a question from the online audience directed to Mr. Goldberg. And the question is, could you elaborate on the chances of the upcoming summit covering debt solutions as demanded by African countries? Could this be the occasion for Denmark or the EU to recognize the limitations of the G20 Common Framework and become supportive of the establishment of a debt mechanism at UN level as demanded by African partners and as included in the Compromiso de Sevilla? And then I believe Wesley still wants to add a few sentences if that's possible from a technical side, but maybe we can start first with this question if there's no other question in the room.
So Magnus.
Well, thank you very much to the audience for that comprehensive question. So as regards to the outcomes of the EU-AU summit, internal negotiations are still ongoing, so I'm afraid I am not able to comment in any depth on that. I can briefly touch upon what was asked about. There were quite a few elements in there, but I noticed the common framework. And I mean, we share several of the concerns that have already been raised, and we definitely think that debt treatment through the common framework should also be accelerated. And I think it also, maybe to just touch upon a related issue, I think it's also important to, support to remedy the historical underrepresentation that has been of African countries in international fora. That's also, I think, been brought up by several previous speakers. Just important that we give Africa a stronger voice in a more representative international system. So maybe a bit brief, but I hope that was at least partially covering the question.
Yes, it seems indeed, just if you allow me one comment, that when I hear the discussion on, between Europe and Africa, and Europe saying we want to have a mutually beneficial partnership, and given perhaps the comments I was giving myself about the fragmented world and how the tensions and the perhaps some part of the withdrawing of multilateralism, that if there's a really strong partnership between Europe and Africa, addressing also some of the elements of the debt issue, probably not to be able to respond to all the concerns, but to try to find some ways forwards, would be quite relevant in the conclusions of the summit. And I think there is a pillar of the summit that will be dedicated to the multilateralism and how to work together. So there are already discussions, no? Not minus. I know you don't. We cannot preclude of what. Say what will be in the conclusions, but at least that's part of the discussion, isn't it?
So from the summit last year, last time, not last year, 2022, if I'm not mistaken, 3, then it's true that one of the pillars is indeed multilateralism. Now, of course, that will still feature in exactly what way, shape, or form. That is still undecided.
So, call to the Africans, make sure that that your voice is being heard during the summits. There was another question. Yeah, please introduce yourself and ask questions.
Okay, thank you. Thank you to the panel. I'm Yunan Chen. I'm a researcher at ODI Global, working on development finance. I also cover a major part of my research is on China's overseas finance. And I had a question on touching on some of these themes of what is politically feasible and realistic. And Uli, you mentioned, there could be this prospect for, if we bring in MDB participation, that would be catalytic to a broader kind of multilateral response and would add the political pressure for Chinese and other, let's say, non-traditional donors in participating. To connect it to the EU, though, what role or what influence would the EU have in pressuring the MDBs or the IFIs to participate in such a venture? And then the other comment or the other comment I wanted to make, and I would like to hear your thoughts and responses. Also, these proposals of a new UN solution to me seem wildly unrealistic. We have the G20 Common Framework. It's not perfect by any means, but it's the only game in town. So in terms of shaping and creating a better G20 Common Framework that can actually be attractive and useful and efficient for indebted countries, where does the EU, where do European member states, aside from France, have a role to play in improving the processes for the CF? Thank you.
Yeah, please. Thank you. So I'm not saying it's just going to be easy, but I think the starting point is really, is there a political will? So for the time being, most donor countries, including those in the EU, are basically saying, well, we follow the IMF assessment, there is no debt crisis. So that's a bad starting point because it basically ignores reality, because there is a substantial debt crisis facing many countries, not only in Africa. We're just publishing a piece on Latin America and the Caribbean. A lot of small island development states are drowning in debt. and it's really a disaster. So, and if there is kind of a refusal to accept reality, and there's no political will to address the problem, then of course we're not going to move anywhere, and the problem's just going to get worse. Now, things haven't gotten easier with kind of recent geopolitical developments, but so again, I would like to highlight the European countries still have a major presence in major international fora, including the G20, but also they are the major shareholders for, along with the US, of course, in the IMF and the World Bank. So they could use their influence there to push these institutions to move forward. Now, the one thing where I think the US could actually get, they could get involved is, for them, everything is about China. Yeah? And so China is the largest bilateral creditor. I mean, the role of Chinese debt is overplayed, and all these narratives about Chinese debt traps and all that stuff. I mean, that's been A, wrong, and B, very unhelpful, because it just kind of puts China in defense, and China's not gonna, act under pressure like that. So there has to be a kind of constructive proposal, and I think the involvement of MDBs is really critical, because the Chinese say, well, kind of our development bank, and of course banks. You can of course discuss what is a development bank and what's a commercial bank, and kind of in China, everything at the end of the day is kind of public. They're all public banks, but so the Chinese have been massively concerned that their banks, for example, participated in the DSSI, so the debt suspension initiative, whereas private institutions didn't. Yeah? And so they feel they've been kind of disproportionately contributing. So Western countries have refused any involvement of MDBs in debt relief and all that. So if we had some traction on that, I think China could be kind of lured into that. And for the US, the incentive would be that this could be, so if the Europeans and the US were to put forward an ambitious debt relief proposal that China in a way couldn't refuse, that would be a way to kind of force China into also providing debt relief. So it kind of, everyone would have to give something, but I'm not saying it's going to be super easy to come to that, but it's important to look at the incentive structures. But I worry the least about private, because if there is political will in the UK, in the US, in the major financial centers, to have an involvement of private creditors in debt relief, I mean, we can do it. The problem is just there is no political will as of now.
I thought you were ending on a positive note. We can do it. And I was going to say, oh, this is fantastic. We can end.
Well, we can do it. We can do it. But
there's no political will suddenly.
No, but I think it really is about what the president said, kind of here in Brussels, in Europe, we need to realize that, the crisis, the triple crisis that is facing many African countries, this is our problem. And, kind of if African development is going down the drains, it's going to be a massive headache for us. And in this environment, we need friends, kind of the transatlantic relationship is in a very different stage. I mean, Europe needs friends, and for our economy, we need also markets where we can have prosperous relationships with, and these potentially are in Africa. I mean, future population growth, it's in Africa, it's not here.
Perfect. So I have to quote a former US president, yes, we can.
We can,
if we want. So thank you very much. Thank you all for your participation. Thanks for the organizers to bring us all together. Of course, we're very honored to have the presidents as well as the African Union ambassador. Sorry, Wesley, we could not hear your last comment, your last answer of the questions, but thank you very much for your participation. And I want to thank you all, those online and those who came in the room, for for being here together, and let's continue the fight to do what is needed to be done. Thank you very much.
I thought it was so.
The very first time
Yes. Perfect. Okay, great. We'll see your contact. Thank you so much. Yeah, perfect. Nice to meet you.